code software.
I believe I have lost connection.
Welcome to the To Code Software Podcast, episode 12, Xamarin. I'm Tim Purdum.
And I'm Tim J.
And today we're going to talk about Xamarin, Xamarin.Forms, and everything about mobile development in the .NET space. And I have done a little bit of Xamarin development in the past, and Tim has not, so he's going to be interviewing me, kind of like we did with Blazor.
Oh yes, you're going to be doing most of that talking. And I'm going to hit you with the easy question first, and which is, explain to me what Xamarin is now that I know what Blazor is.
Okay, well, first I would say Xamarin's quite a bit older than Blazor. Blazor's only been around for a few years. Xamarin, I should have looked up the date, but it is old. Has been around maybe 10 years. It actually grew up with Mono, which was the original open source .NET implementation. Before Microsoft went open source, they did have, they did allow this open source community to create Mono, which was just a re-implementation of .NET that could run, C# code and VB code, but in an open source way so that they could run it on Linux and they could run it on Mac. And those same people that were creating Mono also created Xamarin as a way to use that new open source runtime and run C# code on mobile, on iOS and Android primarily. Those were the two main targets. It now also will run on Mac OS, and it will also run on Windows, although it's a little silly because you can also just run .NET directly on Windows. So that's kind of where it came out of, was this idea that people who loved .NET, who loved C#, wanted to be able to use it in different scenarios. And so just like Mono, Xamarin was originally outside of Microsoft. It was a private company that created Xamarin. They created Xamarin Studio on the Mac, which was a full IDE. And they started, just selling this project. I believe it had a subscription fee to begin with, but selling it as, hey, here's a way that your developers who are already familiar with .NET can take it and apply it to mobile development. So that's kind of where it started. One of the interesting things about Xamarin is how they have to jump through some different hoops for different platforms. So the first step is that they have to create bindings between C# and whatever the native language is, right? And the native, not even the native language, but the native framework on the different devices. So like in iOS, you have the UI kit, which is a full framework that, has references to views and view controllers and all of these other pieces, and their own implementation of integer and their own implementation of string and all of these things. So the Xamarin team had to create bindings between C# and all of that so that you as the developer could access a UI view, which is a specific thing on iOS.
Okay, so it's an API wrapper then.
Right. Yep. So
Okay.
They wrapped the entire surface of the iOS API and the entire surface of the Android API and let you call into that from C#. And that is mostly what Xamarin itself does. Now I can also get into how it does that. Like I said, there are different hoops that they have to jump through. Mono will run pretty much anywhere, but for iOS, Apple has a requirement that you cannot compile code at runtime. everything has to be pre-compiled ahead of time compilation.
Oh.
So for iOS, what they do is, well, for both systems, they take your C# and they compile it down to IL, to intermediate language, just like the .NET runtime does on Windows. For Android, the mono runtime will run with your application, and this is similar to Blazor WebAssembly, right? It will run with your application, and it will serve up, it will just-in-time compile your IL into running code, and then it will talk back and forth with the Android operating system and the Java runtime there. But for iOS, they had to go a step further, and they had to take the IL and compile it down to ARM processor machine language, so that it could run, fully compiled ahead of time. And I'm not an expert enough to know what you gain, what you lose. I think there are like some reflection limitations there. Like reflection
Yes.
probably doesn't work at all.
Yes, that is the problem with it, because there's a couple of native compilation tools available to .NET now, where you can compile it directly into an executable. And some of that is, well, one version of that is where they just kind of pack all the DLLs into one exe, but you're still kind of, compiling it right there. And there is another way to do it now. I don't remember the exact name of it, but we'll compile it straight down. But when you do that, you lose access to all of system reflection.
Right.
So
Because it can't at runtime look back at the code because it's no longer in IL. It's now been completely compiled down to machine code. And I know that for Blazor and for .NET Core and for other places, Microsoft has been looking at finding a way to merge ahead of time compilation and just-in-time compilation so that you can get the best of both worlds. Which is especially important, like on the web where you're downloading things. And so if you can get the advantage of the ahead of time compilation speed, but also still be able to reflect, that I think would be the best of both worlds.
absolutely.
So that is the difference between Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android, is that the iOS has to compile completely to machine code ahead of time.
But Xamarin makes that transparent. So you as the developer just develop it and it will work the same way on iOS and Android.
Right. Now, using like a .NET Standard library works totally fine with both of them. I believe Xamarin currently supports .NET Standard, is it 2.0? It's whatever we're on at work because we do have some Xamarin projects. Yeah. So it's a little bit behind, but it's essentially, compatible with everything else. And when you get to the UI, like I said, you do have to use these native bindings, which means originally for Xamarin, you would have to create a completely separate Android UI and a completely separate iOS UI because they have different names. Like I said, the UI view on iOS is not going to work on Android because it does not have UIKit. And, there's just so many things on the devices, like how do you access the accelerometer? How do you draw to the screen? How do you do all these different things? They're a little bit different. So that's where Xamarin.Forms comes in. That is a UI layer that they created and stuck on top of Xamarin that abstracts away those two different UIs, or more than two now UIs, and allows you to write to one UI that then renders in two different ways when it runs.
I see. So then you can truly write like system agnostic code and it'll just work through everything and run on whatever particular device.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so originally with just Xamarin, you would write system agnostic business code, but you would still have to write two different UI libraries or two different UI applications. But now with Xamarin.Forms, you can write a single, and if you look at a Xamarin.Forms project right now, and this is going to change with Maui, of course, but right now you get a Xamarin.Forms class library, and then you get an iOS application and an Android application, and you can add like a Windows or a Mac application to that. And so the Xamarin.Forms library is shared across those different applications, but you still see those other applications, and you really don't have to do anything with them except run them.
Interesting.
In the Xamarin.Forms library, what you're dealing with is essentially something that was developed out of WPF, I would say, and UWP, because it's a XAML-based UI framework that, I mean, it doesn't just use XAML. You can, of course, just write it in C#, but it is very similar. It's designed to use MVVM, just like WPF, and has a lot of the same flavor to it, I guess I would say. But there are certainly different names of things. I think I mentioned that when we were talking about MVVM in the other episode. Like a stack panel instead of a stack layout, or vice versa. I can never remember because I've used both. Which one's which until I look at it.
Well, you teased my next question already, and you mentioned
Okay.
Maui. And I think now that we've talked about Blazor, and we just started talking about Xamarin, and we've had a nice talk about WPF and MVVM, now we can kind of understand Maui's place in this. So,
Right.
so tell me, how does Maui relate to Xamarin?
Maui is the forward path for Xamarin and Xamarin.Forms. And it is also probably intended, or possibly intended, to usurp things like WPF and UWP. You know, I think Microsoft's going to keep all of that wide open as long as they can to see, you know, what catches on. But the name of Maui is multi-platform application user interface, right? So it's really designed to be their one universal UI. And it is going to be based on Xamarin.Forms. So right now, the main ideas that they're talking about is it will function just like Xamarin.Forms does currently. And you can, like I said, you can add a UWP target. You can add a Mac OS target. I believe there might be a WPF target to Xamarin.Forms, because Xamarin.Forms, remember, compiles down to something native. So it will work just like that, but instead for Maui, instead of having to deal with an iOS executable and an Android executable and a Windows executable, they're going to put that all into one project, so that it's like one project with multiple targets. And that will just kind of clean up the design, the development environment. They're trying to hide a lot of the abstraction. You know, also the fact, along with Maui, of course, is coming out next year with .NET 6, and the point of .NET 5 was abstracting away the difference between Mono and .NET Core and .NET Framework, right? So this is the same deal here. We're abstracting away. Now, behind the scenes, it's probably still going to be compiling with Mono on iOS and Android, just because Mono's already there. Or maybe we're not calling it, I mean, we won't call it Mono anymore, but it will still be what used to be Mono.
Although .NET Core compiles on Android and iOS now, I'm fairly certain of it.
It might, but it doesn't run Xamarin, at least not currently. I don't know exactly. There's a lot of cross-pollination between the Mono and the .NET Core team now, and I think the goal is to keep doing that. And really the only difference then will be the targets. Like, all right, we're going to have one implementation that targets iOS and runs really well there, and we're just going to keep improving that one, whichever route that came from, whether it came from Mono or .NET Core. We're just going to call that .NET, and it runs on iOS. And so then over here we have the same thing for Android. Whatever runs best and targets that platform, we're going to call that .NET. So the old names will no longer matter that much.
Xamarin must have been quite successful then for Microsoft to kind of want to take that and adopt it as a very, large scale technology. So tell me a little bit more about like what makes Xamarin, really awesome and why it is so desired.
Sure. One thing is that .NET has been for quite some time a very large ecosystem of developers, and so just like when Blazor is trying to make the web accessible to .NET developers, and before that we had web forms and all of that, Xamarin is trying to make mobile accessible to .NET developers. So that's a big part of it, is that you have that kind of built-in community from .NET. But the other thing is the idea of write once, run anywhere. A lot of software companies in the late aughts and early 2010s were having to hire an iOS developer and an Android developer in order to port all of their software from whatever desktop environment or whatever web they had into the mobile space. Mm-hmm. And so that basically meant writing everything 3 times, right? You had to write everything in Objective-C or Swift for iOS, and you had to write everything in Java for Android. And that's a pain to have to write everything like that. And even before you had the UI shareable in Xamarin.Forms, just the idea that you could share, let's say, your repository logic and your business logic and everything underneath the UI layer, that was really helpful to be able to write that once and run it in multiple places. So Xamarin made that possible. In that way, Xamarin's biggest competitors are mostly JavaScript-based things like React Native. Mm-hmm. So React Native took the React framework from the web and then does the same thing as Xamarin. It actually takes whatever your HTML React components are, and it converts those into native components. So in that way, it's a direct competitor to Xamarin.Forms. The main difference is you're writing in JavaScript instead of in C#. Definitely C# is my preference for writing because I like static typing.
Well, I mean, .NET has been trying, the whole .NET team and the ecosystem has been trying very hard to make sure that once you know C# really, that you can use it everywhere. There's a way to use it on the web, and there's now going to be a way to use it on all of these devices, and you can use it for games programming and, all of these other places. And I think that's probably kind of where this thought came from. Like you said, we've got all of this stuff. We can target all these other platforms. Phones are starting to become big guys. We need to get something out there. And I guess Xamarin must have done it very well the first try.
Yeah,
because I hear about it all the time, and it seems very popular.
It is very popular. I think it's used by a lot of large companies. I'm sure there's a list on Microsoft's site somewhere that I could look up and link to. Because, like I said, you can take especially if you're already using .NET, but you can take those same developers and just say, okay, now we need a mobile client. And then they do that. And we're working on that for our company. Well, I shouldn't say we are. Our company is working on that as well, taking what is a Windows-based application and trying to make mobile clients for it. Mm-hmm. And you can still use a lot of the same web API stuff that you would use anywhere else. So it's very common for mobile and Xamarin.Forms applications to have, a back-end server that it's calling to get data from a database. Mm-hmm. And, you get to do all of the user account login registration stuff that then can be shared across devices and all of that fun stuff. There is one other piece that I'd like to mention about Xamarin that's not Xamarin itself, and it's not Xamarin Forms. It's called Xamarin.Essentials. And Xamarin Essentials is basically a library of all of these other things like accelerometer, app information, app theme, battery, clipboard, compass, detect shake on the device, access the email system, the flashlight, the geolocation, access the maps, open the browser, dial the phone, access all the local permissions and the local preferences, text to speech, vibrate. So basically, it's a wrapper around all of those features that are native to the two platforms, iOS and Android, and then giving you a single API that you can call into from Xamarin Forms.
Now that is also very cool to hear because
Yeah.
that's not something, you're thinking about just a UI and you want it to be universal. You kind of have to give up that, a vibration function doesn't make any sense if you're developing an application somebody's going to look at on their computer
Right.
or like their Xbox or their PlayStation. But when you get into that level, it's kind of nice to know that they also thought of combining all of those features together.
Right. So, like I said, Xamarin Forms tries to do that for the UI, tries to abstract it away and give you a single design. It's going to look different when it renders, right? It's
Hmm.
going to use the default rendering on iOS and on Android until you tell it to do something else. So a button is going to look like an iOS button or an Android button. A tab view is going to
Hmm.
look completely different on the two devices. The menus are going to look completely different on the two devices with one, XAML UI layout. So
Hmm.
that's kind of different than WPF, where we're used to being able to look at the designer and see it
Hmm.
like, oh, that's what it looks like. Well, with the Xamarin designer, you have to look at it either here's the iOS rendering or here's the Android rendering.
Hmm.
And of course, then you also have to deal with things like different screen sizes that we don't have to worry
Hmm.
about in WPF.
Yeah.
But one kind of cool thing that Xamarin Forms also exposes is these things called custom renderers. And so a custom renderer is when you find something that you want to do that isn't in Xamarin Forms. And you want and that you can't just build, because you can of course put together different components to build it just like you would in WPF. But let's say, well, I built one a couple years back that was an edit box. I believe it's called edit. What is it called? Edit form on Xamarin Forms. Anyways, it's like a text box, right?
Hmm.
And I wanted one that would have little pop-ups of bold, italic, underline, the buttons, formatting buttons, right above the box. Because I thought, well, that would be cool. Because then,
Hmm.
wherever it's at on the screen, you can type into that. It probably, in hindsight, was not the best idea for mobile design. But the way I did that was through these custom renderers. So I had to create a file in the Xamarin.iOS project, and I had to create a file in the Xamarin.Android project, and I had to use those native API calls to get the right, like, get the button and get the stack panel that I was putting them in, and all
Hmm.
of those things in the UI. And then back in your Xamarin Forms project, there's like a dependency injection framework thing that basically says go look for the implementation of this when you run or when you're compiled. So then it could find my Android implementation when it was running or compiling for Android, and it could find my iOS implementation when it was compiling for iOS. So it is completely extendable,
Hmm.
and you can custom make anything you want. But it does help to have a little bit of familiarity with those other platforms. Like,
Hmm.
I would probably recommend that anyone that wants to get into Xamarin.Forms from .NET also consider like writing a simple, hello world app in Java on Android and in Swift on iOS, just to get a feel for what things are called,
Hmm.
what the native API pieces are, so that when you do have to dive into those on Xamarin, they're not completely foreign.
So with Xamarin now working this way, how performant is it? Does it feel very snappy like WPF generally does, where, it's a very smooth user experience? Are there limitations to what it can do?
It really is running natively on the devices, especially the iOS version that pre-compiles. There is no difference between a Xamarin application or Xamarin.Forms and an application written in Swift. Once it compiles, they are identical. So you are running
Mm,
as well as you can run because it is just running in the machine language on the machine.
mm,
And as far as I know, Mono running on Android also has no discernible performance issues. Again, it's a small Mono runtime and it's just running your application and then it's calling back into the Android APIs for things that it needs to.
mm. All right, well, another question, and maybe it's a silly question. What's the difference between Blazor and Xamarin?
Yeah, I think that to me it's a silly question, but it's just really obvious to me, I guess. Blazor is designed for web development, and it is taking C sharp and moving it to the web. And so it's for creating websites and creating applications that will run in a browser. Xamarin is for mobile development. It's taking C sharp and creating apps that you would actually download from the app stores. So they're really wildly different. UI design, Blazor is HTML based, and Xamarin Forms is XAML based. So
Hmm.
they have those differences as well. We should probably talk also about app stores because that is kind of a crazy thing
Oh man.
with mobile development. So if you're a mobile developer, you or your company needs to have a membership to the Apple App Store, like a developer license. And the same with Google to get into the Play Store. The Apple one is the expensive one. It's like $100 a year. So it's tough to be just dabbling in this space because of that.
Hmm.
There are also quite a few gotchas when you're actually uploading it to the store. So let's say you have your account. Well, now you have to, first of all, you have to test everything thoroughly yourself because they're going to run your program, Apple especially. And if they find anything buggy in it, they will bounce it right back to you and they will not let you deploy it. So that's good and bad. It's great that somebody else is checking your code or you're, running the application, but it's bad because it can cost you a lot of time back and forth. It can take up to a week for that review process from Apple. Usually these days it doesn't. Usually it's more like 2 or 3 days, but it has been known to take up to a week. You also have to have images to put in the App Store, and you have to have icons for. You have to have a 16 by 16 icon. You have to have a 32 by 32 icon. You have to have a 64 by 64 icon. All the way up to, like, I don't even know, 258 or whatever. And you have to upload all of those. Like, you can't just upload the biggest one and then they can figure it out. No, 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 no. You have to create and upload all those different size icons. And the same thing with screenshots. You have to have an iPhone 12 screenshot and an iPhone 5 screenshot and an iPad screenshot. And it's very time consuming to put together the application for an app. Then you have to, say, all right, well, you have to say this is safe for kids or this is not safe for kids. If you want to put in like an in-app purchase, well, that's a lot of special code that is completely different from iOS and Android, so you'd have to write that twice. If you wanted to put advertisements in there, again, specialized code, there's a certain way you have to do it according to especially Apple's rules. So it's not an easy process to become an app developer.
I'm not sure if you've heard the news related. Microsoft's Game Pass is coming to mobile devices in, I believe it's September 10th. So if you're a Game Pass subscriber, which shameless plug, I am, you're going to be able to, on your Android phone, play like 100 different games for free. I don't know the exact list of them yet, but they're quite nice. And this is available on the Play Store for free. You just have to be a Game Pass member. But it's being blocked by Apple because Apple's just like, it competes with us. And that's it. That's all they'll say. And there's this huge back and forth because a lot of people, have iPhones, but they also have Game Pass and they would like to get access to these free games. And it's 100% on Apple doing that. And it's a very high profile thing right now, but it's not the first time I've heard of Apple's store sometimes just saying, you don't make it and we're not going to tell you why.
Right. Yeah, their rules have been really annoying many times, especially when they're dealing with applications from other companies. I'll give you a great example. The Kindle app on iOS will not let you purchase anything, will not let you buy a book, because if Amazon did that on the iPhone, they'd have to give Apple 30% of every ebook sale. So instead, you can read them on there, but then you have to open your browser and buy the books. And they can't even have a direct link to that to open the browser because of Apple's rules. So there are a lot of instances like that where Apple has, because they want their 30% cut of everything that goes on to the iPhone, they cause problems. Magazines and newspaper subscriptions. For example, I have a subscription to the New York Times. Well, I always intentionally go to that website and I sign up for that subscription, because if I go to the New York Times app and sign up for the subscription, I just gave Apple 30% of the New York Times income. So it's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But, you have the flip side, which is the Google Play Store hardly reviews your apps. And so we have security issues where we don't really know what we're downloading, and what, you'll have to just decide, who do I trust? Because nobody has reviewed it for dangerous malware or anything.
It seems funny to me that Android versus Apple feels a lot like Windows versus Apple.
Oh, sure.
Windows versus Mac OS, I should be more specific.
And the main difference is that, well, Android's such a weird thing because it's open, it's free. The phone makers don't pay for it, but yet if they want to fix things on it or improve things on it, it all has to be approved by Google, and you end up with all these tie-ins from Google, which are in some ways just as scary as the Apple stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Let's see, did we cover Xamarin pretty well?
Well, it certainly improved my understanding of it. I always see lots of talk of Xamarin and Blazor all over the internet, just as a generalized thing. And I haven't really looked into it too much. My interests lie elsewhere. And so it's kind of been one of those things that I understood sort of the role it played, but I wasn't sure, because I've heard of other cross-platform UIs. Avalon is one I've seen mentioned a couple of times. I know there's others that are kind of designed to do that, where they're like, hey, yep, write your code here and it'll run on Android and it will run on iOS. And I've always
Mhm.
been kind of curious, there's so many of them out there. Was Xamarin really successful and saw a lot of adoption? That's why Maui is kind of piggybacking off of that. Or is that just Microsoft saying, nope, we're going to do it our way? And we don't care that there's other options out there that are actually, say, better or more successful. Do you know much about adoption percentages or what the most popular one is when it comes to, writing in .NET and running on mobile devices?
Xamarin is really, as far as I know, the only way to use .NET to write mobile applications. I'm sure there have been some other attempts out there, but none that got the support from the community first and then got Microsoft support when they bought Xamarin and included it. And that was just, a big signal that this was the way to go. You have a hotspot?
I do have a hotspot, and my hotspot hopefully doesn't come off as political or anything, and that is solidarity. And I will say it like this: I very rarely leave my house during all of this. I find it nice just to stay here with my wife and stay out of trouble and all of that. But we had to leave the house recently for a couple of different things. And I was really impressed to see a lot of businesses cracking down on things and being very safe. And we went into a pizza place to pick up a pizza, and the person there was very happy that we were wearing masks and that we weren't throwing a fit about it. We were really, really like happy about it. And there was lots of signage all over this store, and that's kind of a big problem in this area. But when I went out today to all of my shopping, everybody was wearing masks. And it was just a very good feeling that everybody's taking this seriously and kind of working together. And I just really like to see that sort of thing when everybody's getting along. And that's my hot spot, is just do the right thing. Just wear your mask and don't cause problems. Don't try to make this more than it is. Just wear your mask. It's not difficult to do. And everybody was doing it today, and it was a really pleasant experience. I felt comfortable like quasi talking to people because everybody was distant and wearing masks, and it felt like returning to normal. And so all you got to do is just wear your mask, and then everything's going to feel a lot better.
Yeah. Well, I completely 100% agree with you. Unfortunately, where I live is not quite so
Hmm.
in agreement on things. I went out to get dinner last night, and our restaurants are open for indoor seating,
Yep.
but I did not. I mean, I ordered to go, but I still had to go into the building where all these people were sitting around eating without masks, and people were standing too close together. And granted, there was not enough space, and there were too many people because it was a popular restaurant, so it wasn't really anyone's fault. But even the people that were wearing masks were like crammed in there together, and it was
Hmm.
just. I wish that we had a mask mandate, but we do not.
Yeah. No, even here where there are mask mandates, most of the restaurants are open and we've driven by and they're just completely, the parking lots are overfilling, and it's kind of scary a little bit. And it's really reassuring when sometimes I go into some places that I would kind of assume might be less observant of that, because I also live in a more rural area.
Mhm.
We'll just leave it at that. And seeing places that are actually really on top of it is a very wonderful thing for me. And I will definitely, like, I've been very careful about where I've been spending my money. And
Right.
that's really a lot of it, is the local businesses that are taking this seriously are getting my money. And that's kind of my way of following this sort of thing.
Yeah, I have a lot of empathy for the business owners as well because they are in a tough situation, like a no-win situation, especially if you serve food, because it's, having those people in their restaurant, say, is their business. I mean, that is how they make money. But then, I have seen a lot of places that start out with none of the employees even wearing masks, and then gradually over time they've gotten better and better about it. So I feel better about supporting those businesses as well.
Yeah.
Well, my hotspot, I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but have you heard of the Meadow board?
Meadow board. I have not.
So I've done some tinkering in the past with Arduinos, and like I've got a little robot car and a little arm and, some little toy things that I can build with Arduinos. The downside of an Arduino is simply that you're writing in C, essentially. And a Meadow board is a .NET enabled Arduino, essentially. It's a very small little controller board that will run .NET code. So I bought one, and I wanted to support this company because it's a pretty new idea. There was a thing called NetDuino that was earlier, but then that was discontinued. So this company, the company is called Wilderness Labs. And the Meadow board, I think it was like $50 maybe and that comes with a few extra things that you can plug into it. But it's also fully compatible. Since you're just plugging wires into a breadboard, I can use all of my other Arduino items with it and just program this board in C# instead of having to program in C, which I thought was kind of a cool idea.
I'd heard of NetDuinos before, but I hadn't been aware that something newer was out. And that's kind of nice to know that such a thing exists.
I heard a podcast with the guy from Wilderness Labs, and he was talking about what the difference was. Like there was something that was definitely better about this than NetDuino. I think it was kind of along the same lines that we were talking about with Xamarin, where like the old way of doing it was compiling everything down ahead of time. And with this newer one, it actually is running .NET on the board. So you can do reflection and things like that. So I want to say that's the difference, but I'm not 100% sure.
Well, make sure you put a link to it down in the description because I'd like to check that out as well.
Yeah. And I have not built anything with mine yet. It's still sitting in the box, but when I do, I will let you know. All right. Episode 12 in the can.
Feels nice. Nice. Well, as the year ticks on, we'll have even more of them.
And if you've made it this far, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Play or Stitcher or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Or visit us at tocode.software and leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you'd like to hear on the show. And Tim, have a great week.
Yeah, you as well.